Now, if you're somebody who follows anybody else in the psychedelic space, you have probably heard of my next guest, which is Dennis Walker. And Dennis is the host of the Mycopreneur podcast, and he's recently been gaining a lot of traction by making really, really great and funny satirical videos about the psychedelic space. And in this conversation, we talk about his first psychedelic experiences. We talk about how he's traveled and how that's influenced him. We talk about the start of Mycopreneur and what that's morphed into. We talk about the landscape of the psychedelic industry and where that's headed and the importance of education. And then we also talk about his book that he's creating called Fungi Diplomacy. So we had a lot of fun recording this, and I hope everybody enjoys listening. You started Mycopreneur when? In 2021, January 2021?
Exactly. I can tell you've done your homework. I like that right away. Yeah, it's something I've been involved with for a long time, is producing podcasts, hosting podcasts, media production, and psychedelics. It just wasn't something that was socially acceptable to talk about. And that's something I bring up a lot on the podcast. It's like, it's not like I'm new to this. It's like I'm new to being public facing and being, so open with my advocacy. And that's something that I feel like I jumped in at a really good time, because at that point, there were really only a handful of podcasts. There was Welcome to Mushroom Hour, there was Mushroom Revival, both of whom the hosts are friends of mine. And now I see, there's one launching every day, and I encourage people to launch their own. There's plenty of room in this space, but I think that getting in slightly ahead of the curve is always a good time if you can do it.
Yeah. What made you at that point finally say, like, fuck it, I'm going to do this. I'm going to start actually openly talking about this thing that's not really socially acceptable still?
Great question. Something I've asked a lot of the early guests on my podcast. And I think it really has to do with the pandemic. Before the pandemic, I was teaching multimedia production at a very well-known high school in San Diego. So the idea of being a public-facing advocate in 2017 or 2018 about my psychedelic use would have been essentially career suicide. It was not something I was able to do. But after the pandemic hit and I exited from school, I didn't want to do the whole online teaching, and a whole bunch of stuff came up around that. I felt a sense of permission, seeing the direction the world was going and feeling like, if I don't talk about this, if I don't start this project now, I'm never going to do it. And it was a little bit nerve rattling at first, because you end up having these uncomfortable conversations where, like, my parents, who are both not interested at all and, historically have been quite opposed to psychedelics and drug use and what they see as sort of like drug use, right? This encapsulated kind of Reaganized view of things, of like, drugs are bad. It was really awkward when I'd be like, I was probably 25 episodes deep and I'm interviewing CEOs of publicly traded companies and biotech people from, Europe and stuff like that. And I have to have these uncomfortable conversations where they're like, so what is this podcast you're doing? And you're talking about drugs? And I think obviously with the way that society has been heading and the culture has been heading, it's a lot more normalized now. So it's a lot more easy to have those conversations. But for a period of time there, as recently as a year ago, it was still quite uncomfortable. And I don't know if you've experienced this, but I've invited friends on the podcast who are advocates of microdosing or psychedelic use, and they just say, I can't do it. I'm not comfortable with people at my work knowing that I regularly microdose. And that's starting to change more every day, thankfully. But I also have a lot of empathy for people who want to be very private and not public facing about their advocacy and use of various substances.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's definitely something I've experienced. Even people, for me, like within this space that I know, that are like selling, like, certain products that have to do with, like microdose supplements that you could take on the side or something, like they still don't even want their names attached to it. Like they won't put their name on their website or anything like that, because they still have, normal 9-to-5 jobs that they're basically like, if they find out about this, I'm basically going to get fired. And I obviously hope that we get to a point where that's no longer the case. But I mean, I think even talking about just mental health in general, and I mean, the whole reason behind psychedelics is, hopefully, I mean, recreational is fun too, which I still do on a regular basis. But talking even openly about mental health and like depression, like nobody's talking about that shit at work. It's uncomfortable. And so I think a lot of people are still just pretty uncomfortable, not only with that, but then once you add a illegal substance and put that into the mix, it makes it even harder.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And thankfully please.
No. I was just going to kind of segue. It's interesting seeing the landscape shift. And like, I mean, even literally yesterday, I was talking with my grandma, and she was just asking about my recent trip that I went to in Peru, and I didn't really tell her, before that, but she was kind of asking. I was like, by the way, like I did this thing called ayahuasca, and then I gave her the link to my blog and podcast just yesterday, and we're not a family that is very open about our lives at all, and especially definitely not open about drugs are always bad type thing. So that was that was sort of a big step to talk to my family about this in a setting that's not normally where we would ever do that.
Word.
So let's go back to 2006 at the San Diego County Fair, when I believe you had your first mushroom experience.
That's correct. Wow, I'm impressed, man. Nice work, Cam. Nice detective work there.
So tell me about that. You were what, 17 at the time?
Yeah, exactly. It was between my junior and senior years of high school, and I had a baseline experience with cannabis, which actually weed was my first psychedelic experience. And, I see a lot of people using weed extensively recreationally, and I'm a huge fan of that. I'm a total stoner. But for me, it took me a long time to figure out, like, it's more of a tool for me in that I use it in a very introspective way. So, like, I was never comfortable, smoking blunts with people. I would always, like, try to be like, okay, I've had 1 or 2 hits. I'm so high right now. I'm done. And then I would get peer pressure, like, try more. So it took me a long time to figure out, like, weed is actually can be a very powerful psychoactive experience. So I had some experience with sort of psychedelic realms, if you will. And I had been reading about mushrooms, hearing stories about mushrooms, because I went to school in San Diego and, an affluent suburb. So a lot of people had access to things like mushrooms and weed and, all more exotic substances. And it just felt like the time in my life where I was comfortable with the people I was with. I ate a half-eighth, which I had read, it's not going to blow your socks off or whatever. Like, if you eat a half-eighth, it might be intense, but it's not like you're going to the higher visionary realms necessarily. And it was a really impactful and meaningful experience. Like, for me, right off the bat, I could tell that there was something much more profound here than just a recreational fun experience. I also am an advocate for recreational psychedelic use done in a safe and calculated way. And we can elaborate on that. But ate them at the fair. I was on a ski lift type thing, like on a gondola that was going over the fair. And they hit me actually when I was in a house of mirrors, which was like a really, really surreal way to start peaking, where, like, I could see, all of, like, a short version of me and a tall version of me and a twisted, wavy version. And I was in that house of mirrors for like 20 minutes, wandering around, came out the entrance somehow, and just was completely ecstatic. And I felt like the carnival I was at, the fair, is actually a great representation or microcosm of the world that we live in. And that, it is a theater of the absurd. Like, we do live in a very strange time, in a very strange world. And for whatever reason, tripping at the fair made perfect sense to me. And I ended up seeing Ozo Motley, who's a great sort of Latin jazz collective, play. I saw a band called Mini Kiss open for them, which are actually a bunch of, they're little people who play Kiss songs, and some people may have seen them. But can you imagine, like, having your first psychedelic experience, watching Mini Kiss play before 5,000 people, and then catching Ozo Motley while the sun's setting in San Diego? And it was one of the most profound experiences of my life up until that point. And then I was kind of careful about it after that. Like, rather than wanting to rush back there, it was probably another 8 months before I had another experience. And then it picked up considerably from there. But that first experience right off the bat just hit me on a very deep personal level. And I feel very fortunate that I took the dose that allowed me to fully enjoy the experience, because we've probably both seen people who maybe take it the first time and they maybe eat too much and it becomes too intense. So I'm a huge advocate of, like, when you're starting out, you can always eat more. You can't necessarily eat less. So, like, definitely I would rather have, like, a sub-perceptual or, like, a very mellow experience a first time than to try to go straight into the heavy dose realms personally. And that's what I would advise for anybody who might ask.
Yeah, no, 100% in agreement there. Yeah, there's definitely been times where, I mean, I've taken, since I've been experienced, I've taken too much to begin with, being like, I'm totally ready for this. And then at one point it's like, I probably could have taken a little bit less here. Once you start getting into it and you're around a bunch of people, it can, things can escalate. Never, in an unsafe way, but yeah, I mean, set and setting, obviously being around the right people, being in the right place is important before you do any of these types of experiences. So do you still use cannabis regularly for, introspective kind of like healing purposes? Like, do you do it kind of like ceremonially?
Yeah, I use cannabis basically every day, and it's typically edibles. I used to smoke a lot of weed, like a lot, like so many people. And at some point in my life, there was just this transition where I wasn't feeling like I was at the top of my game when I was stoned, specifically in public and like in social settings. And so it took me a while to develop this protocol where I realized like certain substances or not taking substances actually work better for me the reason I'm going to a party is like to meet people and to have fun. And there were too many times where it's like, I just got stoned and now I lost my train of thought and I'm not enjoying myself and I got to go home. So I learned how to compartmentalize where and when I do each substance, and also about mixing, right? I went through the whole gamut, like so many people. There was no drug education, by the way, and I'm sure something you've experienced. Like I grew up with the DARE program in elementary school, just say no. And then I get to high school and college, and it's like a cornucopia of molecules available, and I'm reading all these psychonaut literature, right? And like Arrowwood forums, but there was no sense of harm reduction. There was no conversation about integration. There was nothing like that. So now I use cannabis typically at night, like before, a couple hours before bed. And it's sort of my creative introverted mode. My wife and I like to hang out. Like, I don't want to answer the phone. I don't want to go be in public. And what I really like about it is as someone who's creating a lot of content and working on various projects, I feel like it gives me my own editor where it's like, I'll write something or film something when I'm sober in the day. And then at night, I'll go back and look at it while I'm stoned. And I'm able to like pick up on things that should be changed. So that's kind of how I view it. Like, especially with writing, now that I'm starting to write for more outlets, it's like having your own editor because you're seeing your work with a totally different set of eyes. And I guess, I've heard people talk about this, but at this point in my life, it's true. Like, I'm so much more invested in the projects that I'm working on that's where I want to be. Like, I want to be in my studio. I don't necessarily want to be out at the most poppin' party in town or, doing this, that, and the other. And I think that's something that happens. Like, when you get really deeply invested in a project you're working on, that's what gives you the most fulfillment. So now, with Mycopreneur, it's just like, this is what I want to do. I want to be in my studio. I want to be working. And then at night, I'll get stoned and I'll come back and kind of, be my own editor. So that's essentially how I use cannabis in my life. Okay.
Got it. So when you, I guess, kind of like going through your life, like even before Mycopreneur, like was there ever a point, like, did you feel like, fuck, like, I don't know what the fuck I'm doing? I know you've had like quite an interesting series of odd jobs and you've traveled around all the time. Was like, I guess, what was the motivation behind doing all of those things and not doing the same thing for a very long time? Was it just not having like that passion for whatever you were doing?
Yeah, I think a big part of life is stuff happens accidentally on purpose. It's like you dabble in this and dabble in that, and then an opportunity comes up. And travel has been something that's been really important to me and to my family for my whole life. Like, I grew up hosting foreign exchange students. So, I had probably 18 students that would live for us for 6 months to 12 months at a time, from first grade through 12th grade. And I'm still in touch with all of them. People from Brazil, former Soviet Union, Germany, Venezuela, Ghana, Malaysia, all over the place. So I was fortunate to be able to travel to visit some of them when I was a little bit older, like towards my junior, senior year of high school. International travel really picked up. And then after college, I took a teaching job in Saudi Arabia, and that was my first professional gig. It was just one of those things, like, I was playing in a band, I was selling chai in the financial district in San Francisco. Funny enough, like, I was arguably the first chai walla in the United States, and that's because a woman from India who was an IBM executive ended up leaving her tech job and opening a chai cart, and she made all the chai, and I was the guy selling it. So I'd just be sitting in the financial district selling chai, and everybody would come up, and like Indian people would be like, this is actually really, really good chai. And at that point, it's like, there was like chai tea at Starbucks, and there was no sense of like really craft chai. So anyways, I was doing all that, and I graduated college. I have a media studies degree, and I literally never interviewed for like a big person job, because playing in bands and like being a psychonaut, there was nothing appealing to me at all about, like, I have friends who got in on the ground floor of Airbnb and people working at Google and Dropbox and shit like that. And it never even crossed my mind that that was something I wanted to do. So when I had a chance to go to Saudi Arabia, it was a 3-month contract and it paid fat stacks. And I was like, this is a no-brainer for me. Like, the band's not making any money. It's really hard to be a touring musician. And we did play over in Europe, and like, we have multiple members of that band have gone on to full-on professional careers. One's on the Stones Throw record, Brogan Bentley, shout out, and lots more going on there. But anyways, I'm like, I got to take this job, and 3 months, I can do that. And from there, it just kind of launched me into an extended trip around the world where, you know, I would take weekends in Saudi Arabia and leave because I had the money to do it. I had a circle of friends. So I would just go spend the weekend in Dubai or go to Sri Lanka for a week when we had time off, and all over the Middle East, all over the place. When that finished, I got offered actually a position directing the state-of-the-art, newly built media lab at the biggest military base in the Middle East. And it would have been a contracting position with DynCorp, essentially, which is, you know, a huge military contractor. That was something I had no interest in. It was like, okay, I can make a lot of money, but, you know, I got to go back to the States and hang out with my people and, you know, pursue the artist path, if you will, now that I have a little bit of funding. But yeah, so I basically started traveling around a lot, came back to the States. And by this point, you know, I was already a full-blown psychonaut for years. And so I went back to the States, was there in the summer, started dating the woman who's now my wife. And that was essentially what told me I probably shouldn't go back to Saudi. I should probably stay here and see this out. And then maybe 5 months into our relationship, we were just like, maybe less than that, we decided to just book a one-way ticket to New Zealand and get a working holiday visa, which is a great life hack if anyone's under 31. So we just flew out to New Zealand with, like, literally at that point, I think I had blown my nest egg and I probably had $2,000 left. And so we left enough for like a ticket back where I'm like, all right, we'll go there, we'll get jobs. And if like whatever happens, like at least we have a slush fund to fly back and we can like go back and live with our parents, which nobody wants to do. No. We ended up going out there, crushed it, you know, both worked in mussel factories. I was selling weed on the down low that, you know, I had a plug with a Maori guy. So I was like triple dipping. Like we were managing a hostel too, all at the same time. So I built up the nest egg again. And then from there, we like flew to Tanzania, went to Africa, went to Nepal. So it's just been something that has always been very important to me. And as we speak, I'm actively gearing up for multiple international trips. And these days, it's my job, which is nice. I'm getting contracted to go out and produce stuff and speak at events. And so that's kind of my in a nutshell, why travel is so important to me.
Okay. I wanna just backtrack a little bit. How did you end up at a fucking mussel factory?
Yeah, dude, that was a good one. So basically, if you get a working holiday visa, which you can do in New Zealand and Australia are two of the best places for it, it's a year long and you're legally allowed to work. And then they have these hostels you go to that are like working hostels where basically you just book a week at a time. And then people come in looking for these contract laborers for all kinds of stuff. So like I worked on a vineyard for one day. I worked picking kiwis for 2 weeks, right? And one day they came in, these people from a green shell mussel factory, which New Zealand has some of the best mussels in the world and are exported all over. Like we were exporting to Dubai, Hong Kong, all over the place. And essentially they just came in and they're like, hey, anybody who wants to come work for us, we've got a 3-month full-time gig. It's $16 an hour. And, you know, you're guaranteed to work X amount of hours per week and there's overtime. And the whole point of being there was like, we want to be able to fund our travels. You know, I don't have like a trust fund or this or that, but I want to travel. So I worked my ass off, dude. Like manual labor in a factory, that's no joke, man. These guys go from sunrise to sunset, just, you know, powering through all day. And a lot of them were like straight up like ex-cons, you know, like Maori people who had brushes with the law. You know, that's an overgeneralization, but that's literally a number of the people that I directly work with fit that character profile. And here I am, this white dude from a suburb in San Diego, you know, packing green shell mussels and like going into the freezer, a huge freezer unit. And you're having to go count the mussels, you know, 6 rows deep. And you're like, if the door closes, I'm fucking dead, you know? So it was quite a exciting time to work in a factory. But that whole experience really humbled me and really showed me like what hard work actually is and actually how good we have it now that, you know, my job is a media personality or a producer or whatever. I get to sit around on a computer. That is a lot more cushy than like 12 hours of intense manual labor day in and day out for years, which a lot of these people are still doing.
When you started Mycopreneur, did you imagine it turning into what it is now currently turned into?
I always had this internal sense of confidence that Mycopreneur was going to be scaled in a very efficient way and that it was going to catch on. And I was actually advised to start the podcast. Some trusted advisors were like, dude, you would be great at this. You should do it. So I started out knowing that it was going to be a quality product. And I came with a baseline of experience having produced very high-end podcasts for a number of different clients. But what I did not expect in a million years is this whole satire comedy angle that's emerged. And that's something that happened completely accidentally on purpose, which I'm super pumped about. And it's sort of like this niche that was largely untapped. And I think where that comes from is like so many people take themselves so seriously. And our culture and our society right now, like look at the political cycle, look at the news cycle. Like it's almost a joke how heightened the tensions are, right? And like how serious everything. We live in a crisis all the time. There's a health crisis. There's an environmental crisis. There's a banking crisis. And I think specifically where the satire is really valuable is for unpacking some of these serious issues in a way that makes them more approachable. And I always use the example of like Trevor Noah or Stephen Colbert. You know, these are like hugely influential newscasters, but they're doing satire. And so I didn't even have any idea that I was good at this or that I should do it. But one day I made a video maybe in February of this year, and it went viral, and it was the response of people that I really respected. You know, people like entrepreneurs around the world, people in the medicine community, people in the psychedelic community, who it was like this uniting force that all of these people from divergent backgrounds and perspectives all seemed to value. And I got so many people who were like, dude, you hit the nail on the head. So then, of course, the next reaction there is like, wow, I just made a 60-second reel and it got, abundantly more traction than the podcasts have been getting. And that's something that I've been very intentional about. Like I've never wanted to grab the lowest hanging fruit or go for the lowest common denominator. Like I'm absolutely not interested in follower count. I'm interested in building an audience and having an intelligent audience who's open to nuance, open to divergent viewpoints, and open to being diplomatic. And these are qualities that are largely lost, I think, and specifically in the social media space. What do you see? You have strangers yelling at each other because we have these deeply embedded views and opinions and perspectives that are all bubbling to the surface now. And social media gives everyone a platform. So like even if you have no qualifications, you're able to confidently project your opinion on a post, right? So my sense is like I want to build a really curated audience and create content for that audience. And I get to the point where I'm like, I hope people unfollow me. Like if you don't agree with one post or whatever, I don't really want you in the audience. I want an audience that is open to constructive conversation and open to debate, et cetera, et cetera. So when I made that reel and I started seeing how many different types of people it resonated with, I thought, well, I just got to do this again. And now the approach I take is I try to make one satirical or comedic reel every day, and I try to do it in an hour. So it's not dominating my whole day. It's like, all right, this is something that's effective. It promotes the podcast. It's grown a life of its own. But I don't want to, spend hours and hours investing in something. I want to be able to do it, top of mind, improv. And that's essentially like the unexpected twist that Mycopreneur has taken is it's essentially an improv platform now where like, even these things I'm posting that are getting highly charged opinions on both sides. I'm like, I really didn't spend that much time thinking about this. Like I'm already on to the next one. And that's something I think, people have a latent capacity for being very, very intelligent and brilliant off the top of their mind. And I think our society right now is really grappling with paralysis by analysis, where people don't know what to think about things because they're very complicated and very complex. So you end up spending so much time thinking about them. And like, perhaps that doesn't actually serve anyone. Perhaps we should, you do want to have due diligence. You do want to do your homework and all that. But like when you're executing something, there's a lot of value to me in first thought, best thought, and shooting from the hip.
Yeah. No, that's super interesting. I'm curious as someone who's obviously friends with and talked to a lot of these entrepreneurs that are in the psychedelic space right now, the direction that it's moving, it seems like it's moving very, very fast. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, it's insane. And I think a lot of people don't even realize how established a lot of these companies are as far as like regulation and licensing and all that goes. I think what we're seeing publicly is the absolute tip of the iceberg. And I think really where you start to tap into that is when you go to these conferences, and there's been a few that have popped up more and more every day, it seems. But I went to my first psychedelic industry conference last year in November of 2021. I got invited out to Vegas to meet Delic, actually from the company I'm repping, Pacific Substrates, which is a really wonderful substrate company. And they were one of the sponsors. I had a friend who was in with them. He's like, hey, I got you a VIP pass. If you want to come out, we'll drive out to Vegas together. So it was super spontaneous. And I just grabbed my childhood best friend. I was like, dude, I don't want to do this drive alone. We literally were like sitting at a bar in San Diego overlooking Mission Beach and booked a hotel room and decided to drive out there. I was like, I got us tickets, we can go. And when you go there, then you start to see how developed these companies are, and there's a lot of people that are pivoting over from the cannabis space, from crypto, from, people who have been successful entrepreneurs who have a cash runway, they have connections, et cetera. After I went to that one, you meet people, do more of the podcast, started getting invited to more, and end up, now I'm getting press passes and going. So I'm like in these rooms with people who are, having these conversations where they're talking with the head of the FDA, and they're talking with like top military generals. And like, there's so much going on right now that just has not even been publicly announced. So as far as like the speed it's moving at, I think a lot of people see that. And like, as a clear illustration of that, I got a call this morning from an entrepreneur who had a product they want to send me. And they're like, oh yeah, like this is actually, a family member's company. And whenever things get regulated, they'll be in every dispensary because they already have that intellect. They already have that infrastructure set up. So as far as like how quickly it's going to move, I think it's going to be shocking how quickly things move. And there's so many people who are like just waiting for the regulatory landscape to be defined. And then they're already ready and they already have the product. They already have multinational corporate infrastructure set up. There's people doing product development in Jamaica where psilocybin mushrooms are legal, right? Yeah. There's people doing stuff over in Holland and in Amsterdam. And, whenever things open up and the dust settles a little bit, they're already there and they already have the money, the connections, the political connections, et cetera. So, that's sort of my rally cry to people is like, find a niche that you can own and dominate. Because if you're thinking you're going to jump in with like a microdosing product, unless you have huge amounts of capital, connections, and previous experience in an industry like cannabis or whatever, I'm not saying it's impossible, but the odds are going to be overwhelmingly against you when you're trying to compete with these major stakeholders who are already established and ready to go. Yeah.
Now, taking a step kind of on the other end of the spectrum, like from the entrepreneurial, people that are trying to actually get in with these products and put them on people, the general public, do you think that the education is there to support all of this? Or do you think this is almost going to kind of be a repeat of what happened in the 60s where people are just going to kind of go out of control once the infrastructure, once it's legal?
Yeah, that's a great question. I already think it's spinning out of control in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And I think that, going to frame my thoughts here real quickly. Yes, I actually just submitted an article this morning for publication addressing this exact topic. And that, as I mentioned, I used to be a high school teacher. There's a huge divide between a legitimate drug education paradigm and the policy and the industry around psychedelics that's being rolled out. And, there's targeted ketamine ads that are being leveraged towards young adults and young adult males who have had no effective drug education. I have a very good friend who's had a career as a therapist for the last 15 years and has a private practice where she works with a lot of like Silicon Valley techies and this and that and the other. And she just had her first client who ordered from one of these at-home mail delivery ketamine services, and it traumatized them because there wasn't a lot of oversight. So it's a slippery slope to even engage this concept, because on the one hand, I believe very strongly in cognitive liberty and of people, having the autonomy to be able to decide for themselves if these substances are right and how to use them, et cetera. But on the other hand, I also recognize there's probably a large percentage of the population who's not able to responsibly do that. And I think that's what we saw in the 60s. And, a case in point there was a young man who recently ate mushrooms, got on an airplane, and then assaulted a flight crew, and it made headlines. And there's a number of stories like that. And I think that these headlines and kind of all of this is being conveniently ignored because psychedelics are the in thing. They're sexy. They're safe. They heal your trauma and your mental illness and all that. But those are actually grossly oversimplified talking points. Yeah. So that's something that I'm very passionately invested in, is to develop more meaningful and more relevant and relatable education paradigms, drug education paradigms that can support this very quick rollout and policy change and the entrepreneurs that are coming out and bringing products out to the market that hopefully it's going to go smoothly. But I think it's not going to go smoothly. And we're starting to see really clear evidence of that. And I can go into that in detail more.
Yeah, no, I definitely appreciate kind of your opinion on that. I mean, do you think that, so all these entrepreneurs that are creating these products and obviously talking about all of the positive experiences, the therapeutic uses, why do you think they're so reluctant to want to talk about sort of what could go wrong? I mean, do you think it's literally just pure like capitalistic greed at this point, or is it, essentially, what are your thoughts on that, if that makes any sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, from a promotional standpoint, if you have a brand that you've built that's invested in this narrative about mental health and healing the world and this and that, you're going to be reluctant when any kind of counterpoint comes up. And I do believe absolutely in the power of psychedelics when used responsibly and in the right environments to have incredible benefits on all levels of a person and of a society. I believe in that. But the more I'm seeing the actual challenges of integrating psychedelics into the world that we currently live in, which is heavily regulated, it's heavily commercialized, and it favors performative clickbait over, more nuanced discussion. And that's something that social media really amplifies. Is social media by nature is performative, right? Like how many people do you know on your feed who are posting about the really shitty day they had, or like, unless they're on public freakouts on Reddit or something, like you're not seeing people, intentionally talk about the dark side of these things. You're seeing people post their vacation photos and their, five course meals they're eating. That's great. I do the same thing, right? But I think that it gets tricky when you start trying to combine self-promotion and social media and psychedelics, because psychedelics also definitely have a much deeper bottom end as far as, the consequences that if you're not prepared, and if you don't know what you're doing, they can have very, very real consequences. And this is something that's starting to come up more, and people are talking about it. And, I don't even want to go too much into detail about specific names and companies and this and that, but like there are a number of high profile companies right now that are actively fending off and trying to mitigate bad press over incidents that have happened that are very grave incidences and allegations. And so from a company standpoint, if you have, 8 or 9 figures, millions and millions of dollars or even billions of dollars that investors have staked into your company, then if, obviously you're going to be incentivized to try to push a more positive, happy, solution-oriented approach. And that's great. But it doesn't excuse the fact that, for example, I'll give you one example. Like there was a guy in Florida last year who shot and killed a father and son while he was high on mushrooms. And that was his only reasoning, is that he was super high. He didn't know what was going on. And he walked up to 2 complete strangers in broad daylight who were eating at a restaurant and shot and killed them. Like how many people in the psychedelic community are talking about that story? I brought that up in an interview on one of my podcasts, and the guy was like, I don't want to talk about it. Like we can't talk about it. It's like, well, this shit is going to happen. And I think part of why I've seen this a lot is having gone to school in San Francisco, it was an absolute zoo, right? You had a bunch of young kids with money, with access to psychedelics and substances, with no parameters, no education, and no guidelines. And I can think off the top of my head of a handful of circumstances where I have close personal friends who were, carried out by an ambulance because they freaked out. One guy bit his tongue off, and I don't want to scare the listeners. I'm just trying to illustrate that like this conversation about rolling psychedelics out into society at large is a lot more nuanced. And there's a lot of topics that people are reluctant to talk about. Happy to talk about the benefits too, in addition to that. I just think that when it comes down to talking about regulation and how we're actually going to do this, it's going to be a lot more regulated than a lot of people want it to be. And that's what I've seen from being involved in this space for a number of years. It's not something I necessarily personally agree with. Like I, cut my teeth eating mushrooms at the county fair and like going to concerts and all that. And like definitely have taken a lot of calculated risks. But now that I'm a little bit older, I guess, and I've kind of seen a little bit more about how like the machinery of society works, I think it's just going to be heavily regulated and standardized. And that is the fact. And that's what's going to happen. And that's where I'm putting my money.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's super important to talk about all of these bad things that have happened because 99.9% of the content that I see out there regarding psychedelics is all overwhelmingly positive. And when something is so overwhelmingly positive, I think that's when you need to be a little bit skeptical of what's actually going on, and why people are so reluctant to talk about the other side of it. I mean, it comes down to transparency at the end of the day. And if there isn't complete transparency, you're setting yourself up to fail.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm happy to pivot this into talking about the benefits and the good side too. But, you said you wanted to get real. And this is something that, these conversations are being had. It's not just, us talking about this. There are a lot of people in the community and people in positions of influence who are starting to talk about these things and about the need for us, like, how do we combine psychedelics, one of the most powerful, transformative experiences and the cornucopia of molecules that fall under that? How do we integrate that into a society that can't agree on anything right now? And we have, a political cycle ramping up where it's insane, dude. Just the amount of vitriol, the amount of, deeply held anger and frustration. It's like, if psychedelics are not used responsibly, it might just amplify those things. And one last thing I want to get on that note is, like, one thing that concerns me is I've seen this trend of, like, people, live streaming their trips or, like, being on social media, being around phones. And I would say, like, don't be around your phone. That's my personal opinion.
Whole point is to disconnect.
That's my personal opinion. Like, it alarms me that, exactly as you said, we need an educational paradigm to roll out. And I know there are people working on it. I'm involved with one of them in the Bay Area, but it needs to be rolled out. Like, if we're going to have products for sale in smart shops and dispensaries and decriminalized cities, there needs to be some kind of, like, meaningful, cohesive education that supports that.
Yeah, I mean, the education, I think, needs to happen first before the products even, like, come to market, because you can't, like, I mean, educating people as they're there, obviously that's better than not having the education at all. But again, it opens the door for a wide variety of misuse if it's available and the education hasn't necessarily been in there, because you can't do your due diligence on whether these people have actually done their education or not. They need to have time to catch up.
Yeah, and I can tell just by talking to you, like, you got a good head on your shoulders, you're witty, you're sharp, and, like, these are good qualities that I think psychedelics can amplify, right? And that's what a lot of people are attracted to them for, is, like, I felt more creative, I was happier, this, that, and the other. But, to pull from psychedelics today, who are friends of mine, and I'm fans of their platform, and I think they pulled it from somewhere else. Psychedelics are non-specific amplifiers, is what they are. Whatever is in your subconscious, it's going to amplify that. So that can be really powerful. Like, let's say you've been dealing with an addiction, you've been dealing with, some trauma, like, it's going to amplify that and bring it to the surface. And if you're in a container where you're supported, where you're prepared for that, where that can happen, that could be really powerful, because you can face it, you can go through it, right? All of these things. If you don't know that, and you're just, somebody who's like, oh, I heard psychedelics are good, I'm going to take 5 grams my first time in public. It's like, this is a recipe for disaster. And until we have more of that kind of regulation, or, like, maybe, another aspect which we talk about would be, like, having indigenous leaders, having people who understand this container. Like, that's the whole point of the ceremony, is that, like, you're prepared for it. In many cases, you might have a certain diet. You're being very intentional. You might be fasting. And then you have a guide, and someone is there. And then after, a lot of times, you're sharing about the experience. There's a reason that ceremony exists, and that these very important safeguards are put into place. Us and the hyper-capitalist, consumer-oriented Western world and global society, like, we don't value ceremony anymore, Instead of, like, sitting down with the family to eat, a lot of times, it's like, go grab a meal at a fast food restaurant, eat on the run. It's like that. Those are very different things than this idea of, like, let's be intentional, let's recognize the risks, and then let's move forward, in a very strategically beneficial way that's actually going to improve our lives, as opposed to re-traumatizing us.
Yeah, no, completely agree. Now, changing subjects here, you're working on a book called Fungi Diplomacy, correct?
Yeah, man, I am.
Okay. I talk about that. How long have you been working on that? What is it about? Do you know when you're going to finish it? I want to hear more about it.
I'm super pumped that you asked that. That project is something that's sort of a long-term passion project, and I've been accruing this line of thinking for a number of years. But the premise of it essentially is that we talk about the fungi kingdom. What if you consider the fungi kingdom to be actually like a nation state, like an entity, and you could belong to it? You could be a citizen there, right? So what I've noticed with mushrooms is they break down a lot of borders, in my opinion. And like if I have a psychedelic experience with someone, I might not even share the same language of them, and you feel very connected to them. And there's this deeply humanizing experience that can come from psychedelics, I think. So the idea of the book is like essentially collecting stories and collecting relationships from around the world and talking about how fungi can play a central role in the way we navigate our relationships between each other and the way we navigate our relationship with the planet and with nature. And something I've been very intentional about with Mycopreneur is platforming and connecting with these fungi entrepreneurs all over the planet. And it's really, really amazing to see how many people sort of arrived at these conclusions independently that they were going to use mushrooms to transform their community. So like a great example, Josephine Nakakandi in Uganda. And this is a woman, Mycopreneur, who teaches and educates about fungi cultivation to critically vulnerable and abjectly impoverished women in Uganda who have no economic opportunity. Now they're on track to do like 500 tons of oyster mushrooms that they're exporting, and they're getting contracts with different agencies and this and that, and they're getting grants. And like, it's radically transformed the livelihoods of an entire community and of literally, hundreds or thousands of women. And you can see that all over the planet. Like people in Finland who come on, they talk about how, they had old growth forests in the north of Finland that were being cut down and used for the paper industry. And now they're able to grow chaga mushrooms on these, and it's regenerative, right? So you see this all over. So people in India talking about how in India, there's an issue with, all kinds of things with the class disparity, and that by growing sustainable and regenerative mycelium meats or, different mushrooms, you're able to actually feed a broad swath of the population for considerably less, and for less, it's less resource intensive than if you were eating other things, or doing more commercialized agriculture that requires a lot more water and a lot more space. So hearing these stories from all over, that's essentially all I wanted to do with the book, is compile the stories and talk about how mushrooms can be used as a diplomatic force for connecting with other people and for humanizing and being able to empathize with each other. Because I've been involved in the world of diplomacy for a number of years at a number of different levels, and it's not really working that well. If you see, we still have major conflicts that are happening every day, in community level, at city level, nation level, and international level. And I don't see any signs of that slowing down personally. So what I think I want to do is I want to build a community of mycopreneurs around the world who are passionately devoted to mushrooms and to learning about mushrooms, and to essentially forming a collaboration with fungi to radically transform your personal life and your community life and wherever it goes from there.
Got it. When you're traveling around, how do you find, like, are you traveling with mushrooms most of the time, or you just somehow have a way to just they just fucking come to you?
Yeah, a little bit of both. I think I'm very intentional about not carrying anything illicit when I travel, because I've done it before and I fucking hate it, dude. Like getting, going through the airport theater of security and all that, and knowing that you have something illicit on you. I fucking hate it, dude. So I will travel with functional mushroom tinctures, and, I get those sourced from all kinds of places. And so, for example, I was over in Baghdad earlier this year, which was just an incredible experience to go to Iraq and see post-war Baghdad, because it's essentially been in a nonstop war since the early 80s. And to be able, they just started issuing visas to Americans, and I have friends in the diplomatic community there. So I went, hung out with them, and I took some cordyceps tincture from my friend in San Diego, and I was giving cordyceps to people out there who have never heard of it. They don't understand. You have to explain it's not illegal, it's not a drug.
Yeah.
And literally, I had a friend who was driving us around. We were in Saddam Hussein's abandoned mansion, which was an insane situation overlooking the ancient city of Babylon, which we were the only people there. Wild. There was literally no one there. And he's super tired because he woke up at 3 a.m. and this and that and the other. And I'm like, I got some cordyceps tinctures. I didn't tell him much about what it would do. I just said, hey, this is kind of like an energy booster. He goes, okay. He takes it. He starts flexing. 3 minutes later, he's like, what? He's like, what was that stuff? He's like, this is profound. And so just, as a testament to that, these things do work if you source the right products. And I do travel with them. I've got lion's mane capsules and, this and that and the other over here. And then as far as like psychoactive fungi, they're actually really, really not hard to find. You just have to go to certain communities, right? Like if you go to a community in Mexico, depending on where you are, it's really not hard to find them. And I would advise like sourcing is a whole art, right? Like if you want to source cannabis or you want to source mushrooms when you're traveling, like a big part of it is like being respectful. You don't go in there and just charge out and start yelling out that you want mushrooms. Like that's the last thing you do. You go in and you build some relationships, you start up some conversations, and we usually telegraph. Sometimes I intentionally dress not to look too much like a tripper, but like trippers usually telegraph that they're trippers. You go and they're wearing like the Ohm scarf and they've got, some tripper glasses on and they're, drinking a hard kombucha and like you can, that kind of stuff. So like, and so, that's a whole
Everything
art
that you
in and of
satirize
itself,
in your
but
videos.
Yeah, exactly. Where do you think I get all the content from?
No, that's awesome. Well, man, I really appreciate your time and appreciate you hopping on the podcast. And everything that you're doing, I'll be sure to link to in the footnotes of the podcast. But I guess any sort of closing things that you would want to discuss that we haven't.
Yeah, I would advise people or just say, please build a personal relationship with mushrooms before you go starting a company. And that's something I've seen time and again in this space is like people trying to jump in just because it's the in thing right now. And you can spot them from a mile away. It's like, you actually never had an ego death, have you? Or like, you don't necessarily have a personal, meaningful relationship. And, that's just something that is my opinion, but like build that relationship first. And when you do that, like a lot of things will come to you much easier because you're not so motivated by, profit. You don't purely think about the bottom line. There's way more that goes into working with mushrooms, in my opinion. And, the other bit that I'll mention is like, just do the things that really get you excited and that really, really move you. Once you move out of that pocket, your operation is not going to last very long. But if you stick to the shit that you really like doing and you really want to get better at and you double down on that, that's what's going to send you a long way. Even if you don't see immediate gratification, like it literally probably took me the better part of a year to get any kind of what I consider meaningful traction on Mycopreneur. And the whole time I was just like, I know I'm going to fucking kill this game. I don't need these numbers to prove that to me. And once you have that sense that you've cultivated for yourself, nothing's going to stop you. So that's my 2 cents. And thank you for having me on your podcast, Cam. I appreciate it.
Appreciate it, Dennis. Thank you. Shout out again to Dennis for hopping on the podcast. I had a ton of fun recording with you, man. So keep it up, and I look forward to continuing to follow you as you progress with Mycopreneur as well. If you enjoyed that, please feel free to like, follow, share, and thank you everybody for listening, and we will see you next week.